Let's start this video with the pandemic. As we're all aware, the world has changed quite drastically, and even if and when we have a vaccination, the threat of the pandemic will always be looming over us, and the knock-on effects of that in society, they're going to be numerous and difficult to predict. But if we think about transport, for instance, before the pandemic, not many people would really bat an eye about getting on a bus or a train and being squeezed up against another person. But now, the idea of that is unthinkable. And indeed, the idea of public transport itself is a difficult one. I mean, no one wants to be on a crowded metal tube with tens or hundreds of other people who may have the virus or some other illness. So that's got to change, at least in some way. And one of the ways that could change is potentially through a renewed interest in driverless cars, given that these could allow people who can't drive, or people who don't want to drive, and even people who just can't get a parking space. It'll allow them to commute in a nice, clean bubble, if you like. So this is by way of introduction to the idea that when thinking about driverless cars, we need to think about how these might be used and secured more broadly and in society generally, as opposed to simply thinking about securing the engineering of the car itself, especially given how prominent a role they might have in the future. Up until now, however, the focus around driverless cars has predominantly been on the technical and engineering side, and really in getting them to work. Now that's a big challenge, and we're still some way off, despite what some people like Elon Musk might be saying. But it's not the only challenge, and indeed, in some ways it may not even be the biggest challenge. Instead, that's likely to be how you might go about integrating these vehicles into the messy reality of society, and how you might secure their use by people and by society more generally, which is a very complicated thing indeed when you consider how interconnected cars are with so many aspects of everyone's lives. I mean, you only have to think about how they might work with other road users, or where liability might rest, or where the cars are allowed even, and what roles they might fulfill, to really begin to see how complex and messy this process could be. Now, as to why there might be a lack of attention paid to securing these social issues, there could be a variety of reasons, not least of which is that the technology is still at an experimental stage, so it's in some ways harder to imagine the wider impacts. But we can and we should try to imagine them, because as we've outlined, the impact is going to be huge, both in terms of the benefits that they might bring, but also the risks should things go wrong. In terms of the security concerns that individual people might have about driverless cars, a helpful way to think about these is to turn to popular culture. So we'll probably have an image of driverless cars in our heads when we think of them, and quite possibly that might stem from a film like Minority Report or Total Recall, or maybe even Transformers. And it's actually quite interesting to think about these vehicles from a popular culture perspective, given its importance in shaping what we expect from a technology. And so one of the things to take away from these portrayals is the loss of control when something goes wrong that most of these films show us. So in I, Robot, when big autonomous lorries get taken over by rogue AI and they try to crush Will Smith's vehicle, or indeed in Minority Report when Tom Cruise has his car overridden by security forces. These are very real and very visceral concerns, because cars are all about moving us safely where we tell them to. But if there's a threat of us losing that control, there are likely to be a lot of concerns, and rightfully so, given that the act of driving here in the future, that'll be controlled and secured by the car and not by the human behind the wheel, which is quite a major change. Of course, despite these concerns about a potential loss of control, there is a reason that driverless cars are proving so popular, or the idea of them is, at least, in that there are a lot of potential benefits that these cars can offer. So beyond extending mobility to people who don't currently drive, and beyond complementing public transport, there's all sorts of other benefits. So just imagine being able to send your child off to school without having to drive them, or of being able to use the time you would have spent driving to catch up on work, or read a book, or whatever it might be. But there are also economic benefits from designing and developing this technology. It may free up people currently doing relatively low-skilled jobs to do other higher-paying ones. Because actually, as we've seen throughout history, technology is generally a great enabler in allowing people to do higher-skilled work and higher-paying work. You only need to look at the Industrial Revolution or the introduction of computers to see that. And there's also going to be big improvements in road safety and corresponding benefits from that. So there will be less of a pressure on the health service, insurance costs will go down, and there'll be all sorts of other benefits that we can't see at the moment. But all of these, of course, rely on the fact that people accept the idea of driverless cars and are willing to use them and interact with them on the roads. But if they don't feel comfortable with the technology, if they don't feel secure around the vehicles, then all these sorts of benefits that people imagine, they could either be diminished or lost. And that's why securing the technology at the level of society and of the people is so important beyond just technically securing it. So it's these sort of wider considerations about how you might secure autonomous vehicles more broadly in society that my report focused on. So I'll briefly go through a bit of what I did in the report and what it covered. So I started with a research question that really centred around how the use of autonomous vehicles can be secured in society. And to go about answering this, or to at least attempt to answer it, I started with some background research on autonomous vehicles to find the wider issues that were being talked about, who the big players are, and where the focus has historically been. So I've already gone over how the focus has been quite technical in the past, with Ford's James Farley, for instance, saying the industry has been focused way too much on the engineering challenge in the past. But there are a variety of other issues that kept cropping up here. So the ethics of autonomous decisions was one. So for instance, the darkest and perhaps most obvious question is, how much value does the car give to an individual life if it has to weigh up who it crashes into, for example? There's also quite a few concerns about what might happen to the job market, given that there's so many jobs that revolve around driving and servicing traditional cars and trucks. There's also concerns about the use of data produced by these cars. So there are a lot of wider questions here about how you might go about securing a variety of issues surrounding these vehicles. And indeed, it's worth pausing just a moment here to focus on what we mean by securing. So to a lot of people, security quite likely means state security, or on the technical side, a firewall or various anti-intrusion measures that could be implemented in a car. But security is a much broader topic than that. And there's the idea of ontological security, which is really about the psychological security of the self as a result of a sense of continuity in life. And this is a particularly useful thing to think about when it comes to autonomous vehicles, because you need people to feel secure around them in order to be willing to use them and interact with them in their day-to-day lives. And so security here is really quite an enmeshed concept that applies to the cars, but also to people and to society. The next stage in the report was to move on to investigate what shapes key decisions about the use of autonomous vehicles in society and how they might be secured. So this involved analysis of evidence submitted to a major parliamentary inquiry on autonomous vehicles, with the aim of finding the prominent themes. So this inquiry was conducted by the Science and Technology Select Committee of the House of Lords and published in 2017. And it contained submissions from a wide range of organisations, from insurers to industry bodies, law firms, consultancy groups, government institutions, motoring groups and academics. So I was interested in finding the main themes that were being talked about here in this evidence, and to do this I used thematic analysis, as described by Braun and Clark. Despite some limitations associated with the evidence, not least of which was the UK focus of the majority of the submissions, and indeed the lack of response from some groups such as car manufacturers and big tech companies, a number of themes were still identified from the data. So with the aid of some critical security questions from Smith, 4 major themes were identified here. So these were acceptance, which centred around various concerns about how the vehicles might be accepted by people. The second theme was wider society, which encompassed discussions about the impact that these vehicles might have on society. The third theme was that of safety, which naturally focused on various safety concerns, including cybersecurity, and how the behaviour of cars and users could impact on safety. And the fourth theme, that was called frameworks, and this was actually the largest theme with the most discussion associated with it in the data, and it covers the various processes that can be used to govern and control these vehicles, be it in terms of liability or regulations, or physical and digital infrastructure, for instance. Naturally, there's a lot of connections between these four themes, both obvious and not obvious, but there's also an overarching narrative that ties them together, which is the idea of trust, which is a term that, for our purposes at least, encompasses the idea of moral acceptability. And it ties together various concerns that were apparent in the data, from achieving that acceptance, often through safety, which is required for the benefits to wider society, and which the frameworks will help to achieve. Yet, despite the apparent importance of trust, it was not a hugely explicit theme within the data, which is somewhat surprising given that it's going to be so important. And you can sort of viscerally understand how important trust is when you think about these vehicles not as abstract theoretical bits of technology, but as massive metal boxes on wheels that can travel, in Germany at least, at 100 miles an hour or 200 miles an hour if you've got the right car. So they can't go wrong. You have to have almost absolute trust in them, because if they did go wrong, they could kill the occupants, they could kill pedestrians and anyone around them. And of course that's true of regular cars now, but with autonomous cars you throw in the risks about them being taken over externally, or maybe code just going wrong and causing a crash, because the car is going to be doing everything now. So with a fully autonomous vehicle, there's no longer the driver as another sanity check, if you like, as a completely separate party to control the driving. With a driverless car, you've just got the one thing, and if something goes wrong, that would be catastrophic. So trust, again, is really important here. And actually, that extends beyond physical safety concerns to privacy concerns about the data that gets produced and shared by the car. So, given this theme of trust emerging, the next stage in the project was to expand on the significance of trust as this sort of major underlying theme in the inquiry, and to see whether this wider importance was reflected in academic literature. To that end, I conducted a lit review that looked at just over 170 papers, collected predominantly from the ACM and IEEE, but also from Google Scholar using a variety of search terms. These were then classified and narrowed down to 10 overarching themes, with the most prominent ones centering around user interface and interactions, along with ones investigating trust in these vehicles and measuring acceptance. The takeaway from this analysis, though, is that whilst initially it seems like there's quite a lot of talk about trust and acceptance in the literature, in actuality these discussions are actually quite granular, and they're mostly quite narrow in scope. So for instance, some of the papers talking about trust, they're actually just talking about a very specific aspect of it, such as how you might design a human-machine interface to encourage the user to trust the reliability of the car, or how the car should behave in terms of its driving style, or indeed how you measure that trust in a simulation. So these aren't addressing broader issues about how you go about building trust more widely in society, or about how you make people feel secure about the idea of driverless cars on the roads. They're very much the sort of concern that the developer of an autonomous car might have, for instance, in terms of getting people to use it comfortably. And in fact, this is where ontological security would come in ideally, and the whole idea of moral acceptability. And these also miss the idea that, in the words of Ken Thompson's paper, it's more important to trust the people who wrote the software than it is to trust the software itself, which seems especially true with autonomous vehicles, given their safety and security implications in the real physical world, and the real need for confidence in the powers that design the car. Hence, what we need going forward is really more research on the wider social and behavioural matters needed to secure the use of these vehicles in society, and to really understand the changes, both positive and negative, that they could impart. Because it's only when we have that understanding can we more intelligently guide the technology towards where people and society want it to go, and feel comfortable about it going. And hence that sort of understanding, it should come from as many groups and disciplines as possible. Because of course, a lot of people, they really care about cars, both in terms of driving or as a safe space. In fact, cars were summed up quite nicely by a French philosopher when he said that, "I think that cars today are almost the exact equivalent of the great Gothic cathedrals. I mean, the supreme creation of an era, conceived with passion by unknown artists, and consumed in image, if not in usage, by a whole population." And hence, given how cars define the lives of so many people, the implications of a shift from human-operated cars to autonomous ones, that'll be a major shift for society, extending from the obvious ways in how people commute and how they spend their time commuting, all the way up to how they consume media, where they choose to live, how secure they feel when they travel, and many other unseen consequences. So in this context, we need to think about securing multiple elements, multiple referent objects, extending from the technical security of the car to securing the stable mental state of people generally, especially given that so much of society, from a successful economy to people's health, stems from being secure in oneself, which means feeling secure around these vehicles that are going to be on the streets and interacting with you in some form on a daily basis. Overall then, the key takeaway from this is that while issues surrounding how you might go about securing autonomous vehicles in society, they are being thought about to some extent, research into this appears to have been surprisingly granular, with a narrow scope, and hence the impact that driverless cars might have on people is perhaps, unsurprisingly, not very clear. But it needs to be much clearer in order to plan for this autonomous future. And hence there's a real need to consider more widely the possible future impact that these vehicles might have, and to think about securing not just the car, but also what surrounds the car, and what goes with it. Which brings us to the end of this talk, so hopefully I've convinced you of why this matters, and of the importance of thinking about securing these cars in society, of securing the people, particularly given the potential benefits that this technology offers. But it's important to keep in mind that these benefits are by no means guaranteed, and should thinking carry on focusing on the technical side, it may well be that these vehicles simply don't fit into the world in the way that the public sees it, or indeed wants it. So I'll leave you with the conclusions I reached at the end of my report, and if you want any more information, then please feel free to have a look at the report itself.